that's really all it comes down to, you know, writing, like, do stuff for reasons. I'm so excited for this video because I'm going to be talking about grammar as it relates to poetry. And I don't really see people talk about grammar in specifically poetry very often. I think that poetry lends itself to specific kinds of grammar mistakes and specific kinds of unnecessary confusion on the reader's part. And I think that's because in poetry you're not as beholden to the rules of grammar. You don't have to use punctuation if you don't want to. You can play around with syntax. You can phrase things in really bizarre and unusual ways that people don't really have a tolerance for in prose. But I really don't think it's a good idea to approach poetry like you are throwing the rule book out completely. And if you are going to break a rule, it's best done if you know that you're doing it and you have a reason why. So I'm just going to run down some common mistakes that I see in poetry. The first is when someone uses the word it or the word that, and it is unclear what it or that refers to. So it and that are both pronouns. They refer generally to specific things, an idea, a concept, an object. And usually that specific thing has been recently mentioned, like in the previous sentence or something like that. The problem is when there are multiple things that it or that could refer to and the distinction is unclear. So I'm going to give an example. First, ignore that this is terrible writing. It's just for example purposes. Your love wraps around me like a blanket. Sunlight pours in through parted curtains, a fierce yellow voice. It warms me from head to toe. I saw the truth, scrawled in a notebook, but now I've lost it. So what is the it in the last line? Is it the truth or is it the notebook? You might argue that it doesn't matter. This is poetry. Ambiguity is cool. Maybe it's the truth, maybe it's the notebook, maybe it's both, maybe it's neither. And you're entitled to that opinion, and I'm going to get to exceptions later. But my point is there's a difference between wanting your reader not to know and you assuming that they are going to know. So are you doing this on purpose is essentially my question with most of these mistakes. Now, I'm a real stickler about this. I would go as far as to argue that the first it was also kind of ambiguous. So, your love wraps around me like a blanket, sunlight pours in through parted curtains, a fierce yellow voice, it warms me from head to toe. What is the it in the third line? It's probably the sunlight, but it could be the love or the blanket, the love wrapping around like a blanket. These are all warm concepts, so I don't think it's super clear which one it's referring to. And this is what I mean when I say that this is a common problem in poetry specifically, because a lot of the time you will pack a stanza full of related concepts or images, and then you throw in an it, and it's kind of hard to tell what the it is referring to. And often it's just better to be specific. I mean, I would ask yourself in cases like this, what would be lost through specificity? And if the answer is nothing, then by all means just be specific about what you mean. Next, I want to talk about confusing similes and metaphors. I find that there's just something about similes and metaphors which, when stacked on top of each other, just lends itself to confusion. When you try to weave multiple comparisons in a single stanza, it's just kind of easy to get confused about what is being compared to what. So with any simile or metaphor, it should be really, really clear that you're comparing two things, and we need to know what those two things are. So here's another example of my terrible example writing. Like a warm blanket, sunlight pouring in through parted curtains, soft as a voice, you envelop me. So is the sunlight like a blanket, or is it the you? What is sharp as a voice? Is that also the sunlight? Is it the you? Is it the curtains? Now maybe this seems over the top, but I actually see writing like this all the time. I think it's very common. Maybe someone writing like this would have thought like it's just too boring to be straightforward, to write this out clearly as like a warm blanket, you envelop me, sunlight pours in through parted curtains, soft as a voice. It's tempting to vary your syntax to make the poem more interesting, because again, that is something you can do in poetry, but messing around with syntax is a lot harder than it looks, and that's the next topic of concern: syntax. So again, you can break the rules as long as you know what they are and you're breaking them for a specific reason. I think that's particularly relevant when it comes to syntax. And I think the reason why this pops up in a lot of beginner people's writing is that they see it being done really expertly in other poets' writing, and they want to imitate it, but it's pretty hard to do effectively. And I think it's just all too easy to try for interesting syntax, but kind of just fall short at like confusion or just ambiguity that doesn't really have a specific purpose in terms of like how it affects the meaning of the poem. So here's an example of a poem doing this really expertly. In my opinion, this is an E.E. Cummings poem. Me up it does, out of the floor quietly stare. A poisoned mouse who's still alive is asking, what have I done that you wouldn't have? Okay, so this was a fun exercise. I tried to take the poem and just make it straightforward, just write it out as a simple sentence or two that are just completely clear. And I actually couldn't do it. I think it's kind of impossible, but I welcome your attempts in the comments if you'd like to try it as well. So I have two options here. The first is, I stare up from the floor quietly at a poisoned mouse who, still alive, is asking, what have I done that you wouldn't have? I had to add a word or two in that one and this one as well. Option 2, I quietly stare up at a poisoned mouse who came out of the floor and, still alive, is asking, what have I done that you wouldn't have? I think it's interesting that it starts off kind of confusing, or very confusing, and becomes more clear syntactically by the end. So doing this exercise, there were specific words and phrases that I just like could not pair definitively to one thing or another. Quietly, out of the floor, up at, I'm not sure who those refer to. So is the mouse staring up quietly out of the floor at the speaker, or is it some combination of both, like maybe the mouse is on the floor and the speaker is staring up who's being quiet? I don't know. Now, this sounds probably like the exact thing I'm saying you shouldn't do, but the question is there a reason why E. Cummings might want the reader to be unsure about these specific phrases and whether they refer to the person or the mouse? So as always with authorial intention, you can never really know, because you're making an argument that someone intended to do something, and unless you can ask them, you can never really know. And Edward, unfortunately, is dead. He can no better tell us than the mouse could. So we can only speculate. But I would argue that there's a very, very good and central reason for the ambiguity here, and that is evidenced in the final line. What have I done that you wouldn't have? In other words, what's the difference between you and me? Why do humans have more right to live than a mouse? Is there really more inherent value in a human than a mouse? Is a human really more ethical than a mouse, etc.? So yeah, I think it actually makes perfect sense and is really tied to the meaning of the poem. It makes sense to me to blur the lines grammatically between the human and the mouse, because that is what the poem is all about. Now, if I were to try to imitate this in my own writing, it would probably turn out like alphabet soup, because I am not Edward. I just don't think you can pull this stuff off without a lot of practice. Next, let's talk about unclear pronouns, as in like she, he, they, you, we, us, etc. Now, you might be thinking, hey, you already talked about this, because it and that, their pronouns, you have to be clear about what they refer to. I already talked about that. But I want to talk about personal pronouns. I want to talk about pronouns that clearly refer to a specific person, but they're not being given a name. I'm not really talking about the problem that comes up in prose a lot, where you might say, Jenny and Mary went to the store and she forgot her wallet, and you don't know who it's referring to. Proper nouns rarely make their way into a poem. Anyway, people don't tend to mention one name, let alone two or three, so like that's not really a common problem in poetry. It is a common problem in prose. But in poetry, what I see is people dropping a personal pronoun in without a lot of context. So this is not like a grammar rule by any means. This is just something that I see. It's just kind of something that bothers me, really. But basically, you know, a wild he appears. No name is given, which is fine. That alone is not a problem. People obviously write poetry about real people in their lives and they don't give them a name. It's perfectly understandable why you would do that. But a lot of time it feels like the writer is assuming that the reader is going to know who they're talking about, in terms of like, who is this person in relation to the speaker? So like, is it your lover? Is it your friend? Is it your dad? Is it God? Like, those are all very different things. Like, very different meanings. And again, you don't have to like specifically tell us, but you do have to provide enough context so that it's reasonable for you to expect the reader to know what you're talking about. So if you want to see an example of this, just go to Instagram and scroll through the poetry there. I mean, again, I have like a personal distaste for this. This might just be my own personal vendetta, but you is really not a synonym for lover. And not all poems are love poems. I just see so many poems and poets that just kind of say, you, the blah, 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 blah. And like, I don't feel like they're giving me sufficient context to really know that this is a love poem, or that this is like about the object of your affection. They're just kind of assuming that anytime I say you should know that I mean the person that I love, because that's basically all I write poems about. And again, I'm not saying you have to specify, but I am interested in why people seem so afraid to just say, like, my boyfriend or my wife. Or at least just, give us the context so we know it's a love poem and we don't have to go hunting and really thinking about, like, who is this you? Because you could be anyone. You, in general, as second person, you tends to mean the reader, like as a directive, or it can mean a specific person who is in, the speaker's life, or it can be the speaker themselves. So you really need to be clear with context, or by just like telling us what the heck you mean. Finally, one last thing I can say is that tense matters in poetry the same as it does in prose. You don't want to be slipping in and out of past and present tense without a good reason and without a good marker that, like, time has changed for a reason. That's really all it comes down to, writing, like, do stuff for reasons. Know what you're doing and why. Oh, I also want to be really crystal clear about something, which is that if you are someone who's been working with me, you sent me a poem or an entire manuscript or something, and you made one of these mistakes and you feel like subtweeted by this video, I just want to address that for a second, because I've worked with a lot of people, and I also scroll through Instagram. I read a lot of beginner poetry. I just read a lot of poetry in general, so, like, I'm not talking about any particular person. I do kind of gain inspiration sometimes. I just learn a lot from working with people. That's why I love it so much. I love reading your poetry and responding to it, because it teaches me a lot and forces me to really articulate what I mean, so I don't just say, I don't like this. I have to give a reason. I have to explain myself. So the videos kind of inform the consulting, and the consulting informs the videos and stuff, but I'm not talking about anyone specific. Lots of people make these mistakes. If you've made one of these mistakes, you should just feel assured that they're common. And if you're not really sure if you're doing one of these things, or you want a better personal explanation, again, as I always say, you can send me poetry in lots of different ways. There's info about that in the video description box below. So if you want me to, like, clarify what I mean with your specific poetry, I think that makes my points a lot more clear, because it puts them in the context of your own writing. So just something to think about. You can send me one poem for as little as $10, so consider it.